Hey, you guys. Hey, guys, this is Mrs. Klein. It's just going to be me on this podcast for lesson 23, the Reconstruction Era. It's the last podcast of the year. The lesson's guiding question is, to what extent did Reconstruction bring African Americans closer to full citizenship? If you want to follow along in the book, you can find this lesson. It starts on page 445. There's key vocabulary that you need to be familiar with as well, and those words are black codes, civil rights, 15th Amendment, 14th Amendment, Freedmen's Bureau, Jim Crow laws, Reconstruction, and 13th Amendment. Here we go. By the end of the Civil War, Americans longed for peace. But what kind of peace? One that punished the South for its rebellion? A peace that helped rebuild the devastated region? A peace that helped the 4 million African Americans freed from slavery become full and equal citizens? The nation would never know how Lincoln planned to achieve such peace. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the war ended, the president was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. After Lincoln's death, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Now we'll talk about presidential reconstruction. As the Civil War ended, people in the United States had sharply different views on how to rebuild the southern states and bring them back into the Union. This period became called Reconstruction. In May of 1865, President Johnson announced his Reconstruction plan. A former Confederate state could rejoin the Union once it had written a new state constitution, elected a new state government, repealed its act of secession, and canceled its war debts. There was a final requirement as well. Every southern state had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. For former slaves called freedmen, the freedom guaranteed by the 13th Amendment brought problems as well as opportunities. To assist former slaves, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. The most lasting benefit of Freedmen's Bureau was in education. Thousands of former slaves, both young and old, flocked to free schools built by the Bureau. As new state governments took power in the South, many Republicans in Congress were alarmed to see that they were headed by the same people who had led the South before the war, wealthy white planters. Once in office, these leaders began passing laws known as black codes to control their former slaves. The black codes served 3 purposes. The first was to limit the rights of freedmen. The second purpose of the black codes was to help planters find workers to replace their slaves. The third purpose of the black codes was to keep the freedmen at the bottom of the social order in the South. Now we'll talk about constitutional reconstruction. As 1865 came to a close, President Johnson announced that Reconstruction was over. The southern states were ready to rejoin the Union. A group of Republicans in Congress, known as the Radical Republicans, did not agree with Johnson and had an additional goal for Reconstruction. They believed that the South would not be completely rebuilt until freedmen were granted the full rights of citizenship. And early in 1866, Radical Republicans joined with more moderate lawmakers to enact 2 bills designed to help freedmen. The first extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. The second was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which struck at the black codes by declaring freedmen to be full citizens with the same civil rights as whites. To further protect the rights of African Americans, Congress approved the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. It also guaranteed all citizens the equal protection of the laws. In 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act. This plan divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a general supported by federal troops. Southerners who had supported the Confederacy were denied the right to vote. Congress also passed 2 acts designed to reduce Johnson's power to interfere with congressional reconstruction. President Johnson blasted both laws as unconstitutional, and to prove his point, he fired one of the officials protected under the Tenure of Office Act. The House of Representatives responded to Johnson's challenge by voting to impeach the president. Despite heavy pressure to convict him, 7 Republicans and 12 Democrats voted not guilty. Johnson escaped removal from office by 1 vote, but he had lost his power. African Americans in the South worked to build new lives. Most former slaves desperately wanted land to farm, but had no money to buy it. Meanwhile, former slave owners needed workers to farm their land, but had no money to pay them. Out of the needs of both groups came a farming system called sharecropping. Planters who turned to sharecropping divided their land into small plots and then rented these plots to individual tenant farmers who paid rent for the land they worked. A few tenants paid the rent for their plots in cash, but most paid their rent by giving the landowner a portion of what they raised. This payment of crops was called a share and was usually about a third or a half of the tenant's crop. Rather than leading to independence, though, sharecropping usually led to a lifetime of poverty and debt. Now we'll move on to Southern Reconstruction. Because Congress had banned former Confederates from voting, the right to vote in the South was limited to three groups: freedmen, white Southerners who had opposed the war, and Northerners who had moved south after the war. African Americans made up the South's largest group of new voters. White Southerners who had not supported secession were the next largest group. The last group of new voters were Northerners who had moved south after the war. New voters in the South cast their first ballots in the 1868 presidential election. Grant was elected with the help of 500,000 Black votes. In 1869, at President Grant's urging, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which said that a citizen's right to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It guaranteed every male citizen the right to vote, regardless of race. When the Army finished registering voters, Southern Reconstruction got underway. Across the South, delegates were elected to constitutional conventions. They wrote constitutions at these conventions. These constitutions were the most progressive or advanced in the nation. Next, Southern governments turned to the task of rebuilding. In addition to constructing new schools and hospitals, work was also begun on damaged roads, bridges, and railroads. About a fifth of the South's new office holders were African Americans. Blacks served in every Southern legislature and held high offices in 3 states. This is now about the end of Reconstruction. Most whites in the South bitterly resented the Southern Reconstruction governments. However, what bothered many Southerners most about their Reconstruction governments was seeing former slaves voting and holding public office. Throughout the South, whites formed secret societies, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, to drive African Americans out of political life. African Americans who did not heed their threats were beaten, tarred and feathered, and even murdered. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed 3 laws to combat violence against African Americans. Known as the Enforcement Acts, these laws made it illegal to prevent another person from voting by bribery, force, or scare tactics. By this time, most Northerners were long losing interest in Reconstruction. One indication of this changing attitude was the passage of the Amnesty Act of 1872. Amnesty means forgiveness for past offenses, and the Amnesty Act allowed most former Confederates to vote once again. And in the election of 1876, Americans went to the polls to choose a new president. The Democrats nominated New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden as their candidate, and Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican nominee. When the votes were counted, Tilden won a majority of popular votes and 184 electoral votes, just one short of the 185 needed for election. Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, appointed a commission to decide which candidate should get the disputed electoral votes. The commission awarded all 20 to Hayes, giving him exactly the 185 he needed. After weeks of negotiation, Democratic and Republican leaders in Congress agreed to a compromise. The Democrats accepted the Electoral Commission's decision, allowing Hayes to become president, and in return, Hayes agreed to withdraw the remaining federal troops that were still occupying Southern states. All right, Reconstruction reversed. With Reconstruction over, Southern leaders talked of building a new South. During Reconstruction, freedmen had pinned their hopes for a better life on education. When Southern Democrats regained control of states, however, they cut spending on education. And by the early 1880s, only about half of all Black children in the South were actually attending school. Southern Democrats also reversed political gains made by freedmen after the war. Many Southern states passed laws requiring citizens who wanted to vote to pay a poll tax. Some Southern states also required citizens to pass a literacy test to show that they could read before allowing them to vote. In theory, these laws applied equally to Blacks and whites, and for that reason did not violate the 15th Amendment. In practice, however, whites were excused from paying poll taxes or taking literacy tests by so-called grandfather clause in the laws. This clause said that the taxes and tests did not apply to any man whose father or grandfather could vote on January 1st, 1867. Because no blacks could vote on that date, the grandfather clause applied only to whites. African Americans protested that these laws denied them their constitutional right to vote. During Reconstruction, most Southern states had outlawed segregation in public places. When Democrats returned to power, they reversed these laws and drew a color line between blacks and whites in public life. Whites called the new segregation acts Jim Crow laws after a black character, Jim Crow, in an Entertainer's Act in the mid-1800s. All right. And we've talked about this case, at least in my class. Maybe Mrs. Wilburn has talked to you guys about the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. So we'll find a little bit more about that right now. The Supreme Court decided in this case, Plessy versus Ferguson, African Americans argued that segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. The Supreme Court decided in this case, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. What the majority of the Supreme Court justices found was that segregation laws did not violate the 14th Amendment, as long as the facilities available to both races were roughly equal. Despite the court's decision that these separate facilities must be equal, those set aside for African Americans were almost always inferior to facilities labeled whites only. Responding to segregation. Blacks who spoke out against white rule risked being attacked by white mobs, and some were lynched or murdered, often by hanging. Thousands of African Americans responded to segregation by actually leaving the South. Many more African Americans migrated to other parts of the United States. Some sought a new life as wage earners by migrating to cities in the North, where they competed for jobs with recent immigrants from Europe and often faced racism, if not Southern-style segregation. Others headed to the West, where they found work as cowboys and Indian fighters. Most African Americans, however, remained in the South. Families, churches, and communities also banded together to build schools and colleges for Black children. When slavery ended in 1865, only 5% of African Americans could read. By 1900, more than 50% could read and write. And that brings us to the end of this podcast on Reconstruction, you guys. So remember, the guiding question for this particular lesson is, to what extent did Reconstruction bring African Americans closer to full citizenship? All right, it's been a pleasure, you guys. Take care.